The map doesn't change with elections anymore, it changes with ultimatums. And right now, the United States has issued one of the most aggressive territorial signals in modern history to a NATO ally: hand over Greenland or face consequences. President Trump didn't frame it as a deal, he framed it as necessity. We're going to be doing something with Greenland, either the nice way or the more difficult way. That isn't negotiation. That's a countdown. Because this isn't about ice, it's about a watchtower over the north, a crown jewel of Arctic control. And if Washington believes Russia and China can encircle North America from above, then friendship becomes optional. If you want the next 10 minutes to explain the next 10 years, subscribe now. Because once a superpower starts taking territory from allies, the old rules don't come back. Now let's be clear about what's really at stake. You're being told this is about defense, national security, early warning systems, a safer North Atlantic. But the real story is far more dangerous. Greenland has become a test case, a test of whether borders still matter when a superpower feels threatened. Because the US is no longer acting like a partner, it's acting like an owner in waiting. And once that mindset takes hold, every alliance becomes conditional. That's why Europe is panicking. Not because they don't understand Russia, but because they do. If Washington believes it must physically possess territory to be safe, then the entire post-war order collapses into one brutal rule: protection has a price, and sovereignty is negotiable. Now we need to understand why this island is so valuable, why it's being treated like a strategic lung, and why the world is being forced to hold its breath. Under the ice of Greenland sits a fortune, not symbolic wealth, a measurable strategic treasure chest, up to $4.4 trillion in untapped value, an estimated 7.3 billion barrels of oil. But oil isn't the real target. The target is the future supply chain of war. Greenland holds 25 of the 34 critical minerals modern militaries depend on, from F-35 components to the smartphone in your pocket. And right now, China controls the Chokepoint, about 70% of rare earth supply and 90% of refining capacity. That's not a market advantage. That's an on-off switch. So Washington looks at Greenland and sees one thing: escape, a way to break Beijing's grip. This is a resource war, disguised as a security operation. Now we move to the ocean line that turns resources into power. There is one choke point that decides whether the North Atlantic is safe or haunted: the GIUK gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. On a map it looks like water. In reality, it's a gate. It's the only exit route for Russian nuclear submarines leaving the Kola Peninsula. The corridor that lets them slip into the Atlantic unseen and threaten the US East Coast with silence. Russian activity here has surged to Cold War highs. Submarines drilling for routes, testing the blind spots. That's why Pentagon planners call it the difference between containment and vulnerability. If the US controls Greenland, it can saturate the waters with sensors, anti-submarine systems, a net you can't swim through. But if it doesn't, the watchtower is blind and the Atlantic becomes permissive. That's when Washington changes its method. Less diplomacy, more coercion. This is where the strategy turns colder and more personal. Washington stops speaking to Denmark like an equal and starts treating Greenland like an asset already halfway separated. A special envoy to Greenland, not to Copenhagen, not through the kingdom, directly. That wasn't a bureaucratic detail. It was a calculated insult. The message was brutal. We are negotiating with the island, not with the owner. And then comes the pressure playbook. Threats, trade leverage, economic pain disguised as policy. Tariffs become a weapon. Markets become hostage collateral. Officials even float a compact of free association offered directly to Greenland, economic aid in exchange for military exclusivity. This isn't alliance behavior, this is Godfather logic. Accept the protection, or suffer the consequences. Now watch why the US becomes even more aggressive when China enters the frame. For 2 decades, China tried to buy Greenland from the inside out. Quietly, patiently, methodically, a polar Silk Road, infrastructure deals, airport funding, mining projects with dual-use shadows. Beijing even called itself a near-Arctic state. Despite being 900 miles away, that phrase sounds harmless until you realize what it really means. Oh, it means the Arctic is a market, and China wants leverage there the same way it gains leverage everywhere else. Debt, infrastructure, strategic dependency, state-owned companies attempt to purchase bases, to build airports that can serve civilian travel today, and military logistics tomorrow. The US reads this as a slow invasion, not with troops, with contracts. So Washington moves to physically block China's future foothold. Deals get canceled, licenses get revoked, projects get killed. The message becomes absolute. The Arctic is closed to Beijing. But the urgency isn't only about China, it's about a terrifying reality. In the Arctic, America is behind. This is the part Washington hates admitting. In the Arctic, the United States is outgunned. Russia turned the region into a military fortress, and it didn't do it overnight. It built the world's largest nuclear icebreaker fleet, while the US struggled to keep even one heavy icebreaker operational. Putin built bases like Alexandra Land, capable of sustaining troops for 18 months autonomously. Hypersonic missiles appear where oceans used to be walls. Runways rise where humans were never supposed to live. And the Northern Fleet isn't symbolic. It represents 2/3 of Russia's naval power, positioned just over the horizon. Putin even predicts the US will try to systematically advance and cut Russia off. So when Trump calls Greenland an existential necessity, he's describing a war map, not a political map. The move isn't confident, it's urgent, a desperate attempt to catch up. But the real explosion happens inside the alliance itself, because when you pressure an ally, you expose the truth of the alliance. Denmark is caught in shock between the integrity of its kingdom and the demands of its most powerful ally. Danish officials call the approach unacceptable. They warn an attack on Greenland could mean the end of NATO. So Denmark tries to buy time and buy peace. Over $4 billion pledged for Arctic defense, long-range drones, missiles, surveillance upgrades, a serious offer, a desperate offer, and Trump dismisses it as buying one more dog sled. That line is not a joke. It's humiliation as strategy. Public, intentional, because humiliation forces submission faster than logic. Denmark retaliates in small ways, excluding US forces from exercises, signaling trust is cracking. This is what alliance collapse looks like in real time. Not one dramatic breakup, a slow erosion of assumption. And Europe sees the risk immediately. So it shifts tactics. It doesn't argue. It pays. Europe realizes it cannot stop the US with logic. So it tries something else. It tries to purchase stability. The strategy becomes everything but territory. Unlimited military access, massive defense spending, more bases, more cooperation, anything as long as Greenland isn't physically handed over. But Europe doesn't just offer money, it offers presence. Troops from France, Germany, and Norway deployed to Greenland, officially as defense support, in reality as deterrence. Because once European soldiers stand on that ice, a US takeover becomes politically radioactive. This isn't a dispute anymore. It becomes a standoff between allies, not with tanks, with positioning, with symbolism, with the fear of a fait accompli. Europe is trying to raise the cost, not in dollars, in headlines, in history. But there is one force neither side can fully control: the people who live there. And they've already said the words, every empire hates hearing. We are not for sale. This is the wildest card in the entire game. 57,000 people, a small population, with a veto strong enough to jam superpower plans. Greenland's government rejects the trade. They've said it plainly. We don't want to be American. We want to be Greenlandic. That isn't emotion. It's sovereignty. And yet, the island is financially dependent on Danish subsidies. That dependency creates vulnerability, pressure points, leverage windows. This is what the US intends to exploit. Not with invasion, with incentives, with deals, with promises of economic support. But Greenland has already proven something dangerous. Local politics can derail global ambition. In 2021, an election effectively banned uranium mining, halting the extraction the superpowers want most. So even if Washington can pressure Copenhagen, it still has to sell the takeover to the island. And that is the hardest part, which is why the conflict escalates. Because when persuasion fails, power reaches for coercion. And that coercion has a name: trade blackmail. Now the crisis turns into an economic hostage situation. Trump threatens tariffs against NATO allies, not as a warning, as a demand, a deal for the complete and total purchase of Greenland, or crushed economies. This is the weaponization of the US market against its partners, a betrayal disguised as negotiation. Europe responds by freezing trade negotiations and threatening retaliation tools built for adversaries. The EU's anti-coercion instrument comes into play, a mechanism designed for economic warfare against China, now aimed at Washington. That alone tells you everything. The transatlantic relationship is no longer based on trust. It's based on leverage. And once trade becomes a weapon, the entire alliance becomes fragile glass. But beneath tariffs and threats, there's a deeper engine pushing this forward. Greenland isn't just security or minerals. It's the gateway to the next global sea lanes. It's the new Suez, forming as the ice disappears. And that means the campaign won't end. It will only evolve,